Pleasure to be here.
So just to give our audience a general understanding of what geopolitics is and its significance, what is it and what does it do?
The core idea is that geography is the single largest factor in determining how we view the world around us. If you are from a mountainous terrain, you're probably going to be relatively distrustful of outsiders, whether you're from Chechnya or Kurdistan or West Virginia. If you're from a plains area with a good river, you're probably used to trading with people from a long way away, and you're pretty tolerant of other cultures, whether you're from New Orleans or Paris. You play that across climate, and you play that across ethnic zones, you play that across agricultural potentials, and you get this beautiful tapestry, this complex story of how we all got to be where we are today.
Okay, and in your books you talked a lot about this global order. What does the order, what is it and what does it mean?
Well, it all started with World War II. The American troops were crossing Western Europe. We eventually got into Germany, and we found ourselves against the Red Army. And at first, it was all a party because the war was over, and then we realized that Stalin was controlling this, and there was absolutely no way that American forces could hold off a Soviet assault. We need to figure out a way to get dozens of different peoples who had just been involved on multiple sides of the most horrific conflict in human history to stand shoulder to shoulder against the Soviets, and not shoulder to shoulder behind us or with us, but in front of us. So we bribed them. We created a global system that would allow anyone to take any of their civilian shipping and send it anywhere on the planet so they could access any raw material, bring it home safely, turn it into a finished product, and then export it to our market for hard currency so they could elevate themselves back up to being developed countries. We basically paid everybody to be on our side, and that gave us the NATO alliance and the Korea alliance and the Japanese and the Taiwanese alliance. And that's what allowed us to contain and ultimately beat back the Soviet Union. The problem, of course, is that, we won, and at the end of the Cold War, we never bothered to rejigger the system for a new era. So for the last 30 years, we've been edging further and further away from the original goals. One president after another has been more and more disinterested in the global system at large, and now, under Donald Trump, it's ending.
The first book you wrote was The Accidental Superpower, and the title itself just makes it seem like this was not something that the Americans wanted or were seeking. Was that the case?
Well, The Accidental Superpower kind of tells the story from a technological point of view about how the great technologies of human development, most notably deep water navigation and industrialization, have moved around over time to kind of put roots down in geographies that support them better and allow them to be better leveraged. So, for example, deep water navigation was started by the Spanish and the Portuguese, but eventually it was brought to fruition under the Brits. Peninsulas are good for naval powers, islands are better. Similar with industrialization. It started with Britain, it moved to Germany. Germany has a better industrial culture, more capital formation, better rivers for internal transport. And then both of those ultimately segued over to North America and put roots down in the United States. And that was the accidental part, the idea that it isn't American culture or American know-how or American technical acumen that has made America a superpower. It's its location, it's its geography. By the time we get to World War II, the United States was already the most powerful military and economic power in the world. And once we got involved in the war and then its aftermath, that's what really set things apart. That's what really changed the system into what it is today.
And so the people that are listening to this are going to be listening from all over the world, and hearing two Americans talk about how impressive America is might sound a little bit biased. So, I mean, depending on which news network you pay attention to, it might sound like America is not impressive. What is your outlook on that, and how was your outlook formed?
Well, the key thing you have to remember about the United States is its power does not come from its involvement in the world. Its security policy comes from its involvement in the world, and that security policy has now been outdated since 1992. So because America's power comes from its own space, its own continent, its own continent, its own cities, its own river system, its own plains, its own farmland, its own industry. The United States doesn't need the global system in order to be a successful country. However, most of the world does need the global order in order to function in the way that it's evolved into. So whenever you're thinking about an export-led economy, whether it's Korea or China or Germany, you have to recall that without the ability to access global resources and global markets, without military force, everything about these systems needs to change. So the United States can go home because it doesn't need the system. The security policy that it wrote that necessitated a global order is long since expired. So the Americans can simply retreat. But for everyone else in the world, an American retreat means that they, either out of desperation or opportunity, have to take matters into their own hands. And that means international trade, especially long-range international trade, becomes flat out impossible, because what works for one country does not work for another. And if countries are going to use military tactics in an effort to shape their world, those tactics are going to rub up against the interests of other countries. We call those wars.
So right now, we are in a kind of a different war, I would say. Whereas in the past, as you have said, we traded bullets. Then we had the order, right? Now it's a health crisis, right? And I would consider this to be our war. How does this change? How does COVID-19 change how the world works?
Well, it speeds things up. I mean, the Americans were turning insular regardless. We were doing so under the last three presidents before Trump. So Trump certainly brings a different tone to American leadership, but it's honestly not all that different if you look at the progression that we've had from Clinton onwards. What COVID has done is it's provided a shock. So when I say the United States can retreat and won't suffer all that much, it's not much of an exaggeration, but it is a little bit of one. So the United States does have trade relations. They're just limited. Between the shale revolution and the American population, we don't need the rest of the world for a lot, but that doesn't mean we don't use it for anything. So if you look at just 5 countries, the United Kingdom, Korea, Japan, Canada, Mexico, these are the 5 nations that the Trump administration has prioritized trade deals with. And with the exception of the UK, all of these trade deals are locked and loaded, they're done, they're ratified, they're being implemented today. Those 5 countries combined are about half of the American trade portfolio. And as a percentage of GDP, the United States is the least trade-involved country in the world. So once these 5 are locked in, and they really are, only about 5% of American GDP comes from linkages to the wider world. 5% is remarkably low. For the Chinese, it's about 30. For the Germans, it's about 50. Now, if you suddenly lost access to 5% of GDP, you would have a recession. It wouldn't be as bad as what we went through in 2007 or 1982, but you would notice it, you would feel it, it would have political connotations. Well, enter COVID. All of a sudden, the United States is looking at a quarter-on-quarter contraction of 15 to 30%. We're not even noticing what's going on with trade right now. And because other countries are experiencing similar impacts, American manufacturers are discovering that we can't wait for other countries to recover. So if there are products that we need, we just need to learn how to make them here ourselves. So the American machine shop industry and a lot of small mom and pops are building like mad, retooling the American industrial base, which means that when we come out of the COVID crisis, a lot of these industries that are dependent upon that 5% will have relocated to the United States. And we won't even notice the difference because the rest of the shock was so extreme. So a year from now, 2 years from now, it'll be done. And it'll have the transition pain will have vanished in the general pain of COVID. And that's when the rest of the world has to figure out how to operate, when the U.S. not only doesn't care, but doesn't even feel it when there's a disruption.
Is this driving, well, I suppose this is absolutely driving the U.S. to become more isolationist, because it sounds like if trade is 5% of our GDP, then it doesn't even matter if we like you said, we won't feel the shock. But are other countries becoming more isolationist as well?
That is going to be a different answer for every country that you're concerned about. One of the things that we have seen since one of the things we've seen since the subprime financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 is that most countries never really recovered. Most of the world went down to 0% interest rates and never went back up. The U.S. and Canada were really the only two that got above 1%. So when it comes to economic stimulus, everybody was dependent upon sales to the American market, either directly or indirectly. And so if the Americans take that market off the table, no one else has really much to sell to. And that's before you start fighting over things like resources or supply lines or proximate relationships or neo-imperial control. So if you're a country that is export-led and you don't have the military capacity to secure an end market or protect your own supply lines, the technical situation for the economic position you're going to find yourself in is screwed. If you do have a military that is capable, all of a sudden you're about to launch a neo-empire. So countries are either going to be facing collapse or need to operate differently both politically and strategically from what they're used to. The country that I'm most concerned about moving forward is probably Germany. I mean, let's be honest. Germany over the last 60 years has kind of evolved into this semi-socialist, semi-pacifist, finger-wagging, idealistic country. Considering what Germany has been in ages past, that's kind of wonderful. But if the Germans lose their end markets and they have to secure control over the supply chains and get control of the resources, well, there's only one way that Germany can do that, and that's by building a military. And, you know, if I lived near Germany and all of a sudden the Germans started massively expanding their defense profile, I'd be really nervous because I can read history.
One of the things that happened at the same time that COVID happened was huge shocks in the oil markets. What do you think will be the effect on currencies, given that oil is so connected to the dollar?
Well, something to keep in mind is that the U.S. dollar is now the only hard currency of size whatsoever. The euro is having a really crappy week right now because it was just a few days ago that the German Constitutional Court said that unless the ECB starts acting differently, the Bundesbank's participation in European monetary policy will be suspended, which is, you know, the end of the end of the European bond market and the end of the euro, honestly. So they now have an existential crisis that is internal, that is divorced from everything else. So regardless of what you thought about the euro before, all of a sudden now we have a constitutional question. The way that the Brits handled Brexit means that the pound is completely off the table as a hard currency of value because nobody knows what it's going to be doing in the next year. The next country down is Canada. Canada has a payments crisis because the province that basically allows Canada to be a socialist paradise, Alberta, is now in a depression and will not recover this year. So everything that makes Canada stable in international trade has just stopped. The next country down is Australia. And, you know, the Aussies are on a tight ship and they're a functional country, but a country of 25 million people absolutely cannot be a global currency. So the dollar has already re-centralized more than at any time since World War II. And the next year, it's only going to see more money pour in, which means, ironically, that the global system, or I'm sorry, I phrased that wrong, which means that the use of the dollar as the reserve currency actually gets reinforced by the American withdrawal. Because if you're going to have a hard currency, if you're going to have a global store of value, you want a currency that is liquid, that is large, and above all, you want the locals to not really care what the value of the currency is every day. Because if they start intervening in currency markets to achieve this or that micro goal, it loses its value as a store of value. Well, the less involved the Americans become in the global system, the more the dollar checks all those boxes, and the less anyone else does. If we are breaking down into a system of regionalized trade, why in the world would you hold the yen if you don't trade with Japan? And that's exactly where we're headed.
In the book, each study ends with a report card on which it has a brief summary, and there's 8 elements in that summary, which is borders, resources, demography, military might, economy, outlook, and then in a word, and it's funny, the in a word for Brazil was nuts. I thought that was great. What is the significance of these elements for the report card?
Sure. There's a chapter in the book called What Makes for a Successful Country, and we go through all of the major factors, whether it's energy supply or trade dependency, agricultural structure, the population structure, everything that it takes to make a country work. And the primary reason of writing this book was to acquaint people with what actually makes a country function in an era when global security is no longer taken care of. The Americans, in creating the order, have created the most placid and peaceful period in human history. It was never going to last. It was always artificial, and it was always done for reasons other than having the goal of having a peaceful world. It was done to fight a war. Well, the war ended. And so we're going back to an older system of governance, an older system of competition in which each country more or less has to look out for themselves. It doesn't mean that alliances can't or won't happen. Of course they will. But the idea that you'll have a single power that provides this blanket security for everything, that is over now. Countries have to look out for their own interests. Not everyone can. The whole idea with the report card was to give an idea of who was stable, who could grow, and who couldn't.
So one of the countries that's mentioned in the book is Venezuela, and I was listening to a different podcast you did with Pump, and you talked about how Venezuela was probably going to fail. What does that look like, and how does it happen?
Yeah, Venezuela is one of those countries that should have been successful. They had the educational base, the industrial base, the infrastructure. They had a skilled population. They had the resources. They were actually even remarkably diversified. But between the Maduro and the Chavez governments, it's been driven to the ground, and it's not an issue of ideology or socialism. It's just flat-out kleptocracy. And now the system has been broken to the point that it probably won't recover, and that was before COVID. What COVID has done is driven oil prices so far below the break-even price for Venezuelan production that the entire system is shutting down. We're probably going to see, Venezuela is no longer a significant exporter, and we're probably going to see Venezuelan oil production go to zero this year. And because the Maduro government has destroyed the country's agricultural production, that means that the population all of a sudden is going to lose 95% of its food supply. That is the end. Most likely we're looking at civic collapse, the power going out and not coming back online, mass famine, and to be perfectly blunt, everyone who was rich enough to fly out flew out 3 years ago, and everyone who was healthy enough to walked out last year. For everyone else, you're probably looking at a 75% reduction in the population in a very short period of time.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Hopefully this next question is a better story. You spoke positively about Southeast Asia in the obviously tourism and textiles are big for their economies. How long will they feel the impacts of not being able to service travelers and make T-shirts and sell them on the market?
Well, let me clarify a couple of things. First of all, Southeast Asia is distinct from South Asia. So Southeast Asia is kind of a triangle of countries from Indonesia to the Philippines to Myanmar. Those are the countries that I am very bullish about. They have stable populations, they're relatively young, they're over-educated for their position in the economic structures of the world, and they have a lot of very densely populated cities, so it depresses their relative labor costs versus everyone else. So what does that mean? It means that they have more skills and they have more infrastructure than you would expect countries of their wealth level to have. And it means that their people will work for a little bit less than you would expect for people of their educational status. That makes them good investment targets. And since they're young and since they're growing, they're consumption-driven economies. So they're relatively insulated from breakdowns in the global networks because they can consume a lot of what they produce, particularly when you consider them as a unit. In addition, These are jungle, mountain, and island and peninsula countries. Normally that's a negative, but it does mean that these countries really don't have a history of going to war with one another, or at least not in the last several hundred years. So you don't have to worry about a Northeast Asian or a Northern European style general conflagration if they do happen to come under economic stress. So you can pick up a lot of economic growth and a lot of industrial capacity from less well-wired parts of the world, transfer it down there, maybe toss in a little dash of American, Canadian, Kiwi, and Australian integration. You've got a nice little system. The textile question, the tourism question. Textiles are a problem for South Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India specifically. Now the problem there is that this is a very labor-intensive industry, and in coronavirus, a lot of it's just shut down. The second part of the problem is that we now have technology, automation, that actually has lower production costs than the unskilled labor that works in the industry normally. So while you can only grow cotton in certain places, there's nothing about the spinning of the yarn, the weaving of the cloth, or the cutting of the clothes that has to be done by people anymore. So the longer we have a disruption because of COVID, the more likely that entire industry is to pick up and go somewhere else. And it'll probably go to places where there's high-end consumption, a relatively stable power system, and a technical workforce that can deal with the automation. That all argues pretty well for the United States and maybe to a slightly lesser degree Mexico. So that's a real problem for South Asia just this year. Tourism, tourism is going to be offline at least until 2022. It's not just an issue of getting past this lockdown. You have to be willing to travel, and that means you have to feel that you're not going to get sick on your way to your destination or while at your destination. Also, the majority of the world's tourist dollars are retirees, and COVID disproportionately targets older folks. So I don't expect air travel in general and tourism specifically to recover for at least a couple of years.
In India, the big place for call centers, right? And you spoke earlier about these call centers being impacted by AI and insourcing. Is India still a growth economy?
India is still a growth economy, and I think it's going to bounce back from COVID in a better position than several other economies. Despite all their political brouhaha with the Modi government, this is still, 1.3 billion people, and even if only 10% of them are doing well, that's still bigger than almost any European country. However, when you're talking tech, the rules get a little different. One of the problems that we're facing in the short term is that this call center issue is where they kind of generate their base development for tech skills. And it's not what most people think. Most people have this image of the tech workers coming into kind of a cube farm, they do their shift and they go home. Well, that's only accurate to a point. The issue is that no one's working on a laptop. Everyone's working on a hard top, the cheapest computer you can possibly have to do the task. And then as soon as the shift ends, a second shift comes in. And then when that ends, a third shift comes in. So you have at least 3 waves of people a day that deal with exactly the same equipment. Well, that doesn't work under COVID. Nor can you send these people home to work from home. These aren't laptops, these are hard tops. And in a lot of places of India, even in places where, like Bangalore, where you've got the tech centers, these people don't go home to having good internet connections or phone connections or even electricity. And if you're going to go through the expense of wiring the home so they can work remotely, well, you might as well just work with people in Wisconsin who can do it from day one. So we're seeing a complete uprooting of the base educational and workforce systems in India that allow it to be a tech player. That's the short-term problem. The longer-term problem is capital. The global demographic is aging pretty rapidly, and the majority of the world's baby boomers were going to enter mass retirement within a couple of years. Well, it's investment capital from the near retirement baby boomers that has been driving the tech boom globally, not just in the United States, globally. And between COVID and their impending retirement, that capital is not going to be available for much longer. And if COVID lasts a year, we've lost half of the time that was left. So India is going to have to figure out how to make that specific sector work without the input stream that they're used to from the call centers, and with more difficult to source and more expensive capital. That doesn't mean an end to the Indian tech sector, but it does mean it's going to slow down a lot.
For China, they are trying to be, they're really focusing on 5G and blockchain technology and be superlative in those. But based on like past conversations you've had, it sounds like they're not trying to take over the world using those technologies, but instead contain their population. Does this put a kink in those plans, or is that right? And does this put a kink in those plans?
Well, the Chinese are going to go after anything that they think they can master. Remember that the financial system there works quite a bit differently. It's more based on throughput than profitability, and that gives them a certain flexibility. It generates vulnerabilities for them, but it gives them a certain flexibility in chasing after sectors. But yes, first and foremost, national control is absolutely the goal of the Chinese Communist Party. So we've seen a national security system of social credit monitoring and population monitoring that honestly would make George Orwell a little nervous. And that system has now been in place for several months and is getting stricter and stricter as we go.
So refocusing back to the investment focus, in terms of the central banks in the Western countries, what tools do they have left? Because interest rates are at record lows. What else can they do to stimulate the economies?
So there's not a lot without changing your economic model. Because if your population is aged, you can't do consumption. If the global trade system is shut down or is going offline, you can't do export-led growth. And investment-led growth requires capital. And if you're moving into mass retirement or if you've got a financial crisis, that's offline. Those are the only three types of economic growth that we know of with our current economic models. And that gets us to kind of a bigger problem down the road. The global demographic is aging. We were going to hit mass retirement in a couple of years. Most countries in the advanced world were probably already there. So if you know the Americans are leaving, and if you know global trade is breaking down, and if you know that investment capital is going to be hard to come by, and if you know if global consumption is no longer viable, then this entire economic model that we follow was at its end. And I don't mean the American-led order here. I'm talking about something a lot broader. Ever since the 1500s with the Columbus expeditions, human economics have been based on the concept of more. Bigger populations, more interconnectivity, greater transport, more financial heft, greater technological development, more consumption. That was all going to end this decade anyway. And COVID has sped things up. Mm-hmm. We need a new economic model. We need a new ism. We know that capitalism doesn't work in this environment. We also know that socialism doesn't work in this environment. We also know that fascism doesn't work in this environment. We don't know what that is. And figuring out what that is, that process, much less the winner, that is going to be the issue that defines the rest of this decade.
One last final question, Peter, and then we'll let you go. If investors want to create an investment strategy looking through a geopolitical lens, what would you say the first 3 steps need to be?
What the first 3 steps? Number one, evaluate your understanding of what you're investing in. Probably the best example of how to not do that is to look at emerging market indexes, because anything that puts Argentina and Turkey and Vietnam and Mexico in the same bucket is absolutely asinine. We are used to drawing artificial boundaries around buckets of investment products and calling them the same, and that is exactly the sort of problem that got us into the asset-backed securities crisis back in 2007. Don't do that. Second, you have to be cognizant of the sourcing of capital. I mean, QE is all well and good, but ultimately most of the world's investment capital comes from people preparing for retirement, and as the world moves into mass retirement, that source is going to dry up. That has pros and cons based on who you are. The obvious con is there's just not going to be a lot of money left, and the velocity of capital isn't going to slow, it's going to reverse. But on the pro side, it means that everyone who's been able to just release all of their investment decision-making into high-velocity trading and automatic trading, that goes away, because that only makes sense in an environment where capital's free. If capital costs something, then you have to look at other risk factors, and that requires somebody actually making decisions. So investment advisors are actually going to have something to do now, aside from just, shuffle money between these different funds. They're actually going to have to look at companies. And that brings us to the third thing. Indexes probably aren't going to make as much sense as they used to. And not simply because pre-World War II, it was the norm for most markets to eventually go to zero. It's like having a bucket of several hundred or thousand companies in a single fund just doesn't make sense in the world we're moving into. It's going to take individual evaluations, and that would suggest that the bond market might become a lot more exciting than the stock market moving forward, because at least there you can hedge your risk based on a company that you can learn about, as opposed to with a fund where it's just a little bit more blind.
Excellent. This has been a wonderful exploration of what geopolitics is and how the world works and how investors can think about it differently. Peter Zeihan, thank you so much. Author of Disunited Nations, which is now out, and you can find that in the link attached. Thank you so much for your time, Peter.
My pleasure. You take care.
You too. Bye-bye.